Good morning. I am delighted to welcome Rachel Kyte, Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University in the United States, and visiting India and now at the Indian School of Business to ink and renew an agreement to work together on several aspects of public policy, especially relevant for the Indian context. I am here to talk to Rachel about some larger questions around sustainability and the grand challenges associated with it. We have been talking about these grand challenges now for close to 30 years, and we have made a lot of progress. There have been several roadblocks. Not everything is going either on schedule or as expected, but there are silver linings and there are several rays of hope. I will ask Rachel for her opinion on a few of these grand challenges, as her experience over the last several decades allows us to peek into the process, the dynamics, the evolution, not just of the sustainability challenge, but our efforts to reach milestones that we have set for ourselves. Welcome, Rachel. I hope your trip to India has been going well so far.
No, it's been great to be back, and it's lovely to be here.
I have a few questions for you. They are very high level, and I want to start with the task that we have set to ourselves as the world, the Sustainable Development Goals. These are, of course, a renewed version of the Millennium Development Goals. They were reworked after considerable discussion from multiple stakeholders, especially civil society and community representatives, those who the Sustainable Development Goals are meant to address. I just wanted to seek your opinion and your experience of working on the Sustainable Development Goals with a question. This was a conversation that I was part of 20 years ago when there was a lot of criticism of the Millennium Development Goals at the turn of the millennium, that putting a number on a concept can actually lead to outcomes that are not quite desirable. Hunger, for example, is very difficult to pin down. We all know what it is, but in terms of a social process, counting the number of hungry people may perhaps not be the best idea. Of course, in other cases it is easier. Maternal mortality is something that we can clearly measure and reduce, but poverty, hunger, even other more general aspirations like climate action, life on land, life underwater. My question to you would be, in terms of trying to nail numbers to the wall, 17 of them, and achieve those numbers could perhaps lead us astray in terms of what the underlying processes and factors that are responsible for producing those numbers. Does your experience suggest otherwise?
Well, I think it's a really great question, but to just step back a little bit, as you said, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were the largest global crowdsourcing of a development agenda that we've ever seen. I mean, the Millennium Development Goals, by contrast, were basically written on the back of an envelope by a small group of mainly men from the global north, in Paris. So this was a fundamentally different process. And I think part of the value and the power of the SDGs is that they were crowdsourced in this way. And if you think now, 7 years in, we're not on track. I mean, let's be very clear, we are not on track. And both COVID, the economic dislocation, and now the war in Ukraine are pushing us off track even more. But there is not a global business in the world that isn't sort of thinking about its business related to the SDGs. Every government is thinking about the SDGs, civil society is oriented around it. So it has galvanized us around a sort of menu card. This is what we've got to get done. So I think there is power in that. Now, underneath the 17 SDGs are hundreds and hundreds of KPIs, right, of indicators. And my experience on working on the indicators for SDG 7, which is sustainable energy, shows that you have to be really clear about what you mean, and it does get complicated. So, for example, the first part of the sustainable energy goal is that everyone should have access to energy. What do we really mean by that, right? So there are people who have no access at all to any energy. So what would be the first step for them? There are people who have access to energy maybe on a Monday and on a Thursday and a little bit on a Saturday. Well, you can't run a business unless you've got reliable, affordable energy. And you can't really be productive in the economy unless you have what we call access to productive use, right? So enough energy to be able to be participating in the economy. So it would be false to say that if you have access to 10 watts of energy, enough to charge a phone and perhaps have a light, that is an answer to poverty. It isn't. It's the first step in a journey out of poverty. And so, you know, considerable work was done by organisations that understand this stuff to sort of build out the tiers of access to energy, and to be very clear that unless you get to tier 3, productive use, you can't really say that you've got access to energy in a meaningful way to combat poverty. And so I think that detail and nuance needs to be understood by policymakers, needs to be understood by development organisations and civil society and industry. But in terms of a public galvanising of the world around what sustainable life would look like, I think the SDGs have been quite powerful.
And they have been successful in galvanizing. And
Right.
I could not agree more that it has brought business, civil society and governments on the same page. But just to push you a little bit more, who can say no to energy for all? It's in that sense an uncontroversial agenda. It's really when, let's say, when push comes to shove, where the question is, should the last dollar, which are scarce in most contexts, should the last dollar be spent on energy for all, or reducing poverty, or maternal mortality, and so on? While the galvanization has served a great purpose, and it has certainly brought attention to the different indicators, would it be correct to say that the trade-offs are perhaps pushed under the rug?
Well, so two things. First of all, there was a lot of controversy in the wording of the SDGs, and there was a lot of controversy in sustainable energy for all. I mean, at one level it's like, what's not to like, right? Sustainable energy for all. But there was a huge fight about the phrase sustainable. There were big fights, including from the Indian government, to have the word modern in there, because they didn't want the word renewable. This is 7 years ago. I think we have a clearer understanding of what sustainable means. For me, the shorthand of SDG 7 is it needs to be clean, affordable and reliable. But that was controversial at the time. And then there was no clarity about the critical path. Well, the critical path, whether you're living in absolute poverty or whether you're living with profligate use and wasteful use of energy, is that your first fuel is energy efficiency. Then you need to make sure that everybody has access. And then thirdly, you need to make sure that that access is clean and reliable. And that's really now what we're seeing. But that was not clear 7 years ago. The second part of your question is, yes, if you had $100 or you had 1 lakh rupee, where would you, in what proportion would you spend it against the goals? And I think a lot of the critics of the goals have sort of said, well, you know, I would spend it here and not here, and that therefore the goals are just confusing and distracting, and they don't lead to a theory of change. But that context is local, and that context is national. I mean, Johan Rockström from the Potsdam Institute has sort of talked about a sort of wedding cake, a Western wedding cake idea of the SDGs, where you have the planetary SDGs, water, the environment here, and then you have the economic SDGs, and then you have the social SDGs. And you can get at the social SDGs, but you can't ignore the planetary boundaries. Others have talked about the fact, and I would argue, having worked on energy for many years, that you can't really get reliable healthcare services if your healthcare services don't have access to reliable energy. So I think you have to contextualise the SDGs then at a local and national level in order to decide where the spending priorities are. But you have to have a theory of change. And as you know from your work here at the Bharti Institute, you can't separate out energy system change from food system change, from financial system change. So the difficulty is in the implementation, obviously.
And perhaps identifying the synergies and trade-offs. So these are synergies that you point to. It's not just that you can't do it, but if you can get a lot more done. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts if you can fix more than two at the same time. But I do want to get back to the question of trade-offs, and one particular trade-off that I have struggled with is related to hydroelectricity. After 30 years of sort of global civil society effort and people's movements around the world that established large dams have very high social and environmental costs and should not be built, and so the World Bank and IFC pull back after great effort around the world, climate change has suddenly pushed large dams back on the table as an option. That is where the evolving understanding of our problems, both local and national, not just global, also impinges on what has often been accomplished. So in India, for example, I believe that policymakers are much more sensitive to social and environmental costs, but not so in many other countries. And the lessons from that global effort, a really global civil society network that exposed the social and environmental costs of large dams, is being undone in sub-Saharan Africa in some ways in the name of climate action?
So I think that in the 80s and 90s, when the world erupted around poorly conceived, poorly consulted, poorly planned, large hydro dams, civil society was the indicator species. It was raising the concerns that were legitimate concerns in the policy planning process, both by national government and by development banks, and it, was not adequate to the task. Now, I think, first of all, the technology or the understanding of how to build dams has moved on. Secondly, the role of hydro, when well built, well curated, is understood. Clearly, I think there's like more than 200 hydro dams across sub-Saharan Africa that are on the books as potential. Whether or not they get built or not is another thing, and it depends on the very fast-changing hydrology in much of the world. So there's much more run of the river, less storage. We know more about storage dams and their methane emissions and how to mitigate that. Floating solar is the World Bank has, I think, come out with a report which shows that there's huge potential for floating solar across Africa and Asia, and the Japanese are very interested in that as well. So I think, look, it's a fast-moving field. And then you go back to sub-Saharan Africa, the development project which captivates the imagination of everybody who comes into the development world, often from politics, into a senior level, and they hear about it, is the Inga Dam on the Congo River. If the Inga Dam was built out to its full sort of planning potential, you're talking about 40 gigawatts, right? That's enough to turn Africa into the manufacturing hub of the world, because it would be clean and abundant. Now, to get from where we are today with just a few megawatts coming off a very old dam that needs refurbishing to building that out, and I'm not at all sure that that 40 gigawatts is sustainable or even desirable, but it's never going to go away as we move away from fossil fuels. So, I think these things take their course. But civil society is normally out there, perhaps, always ahead. And I think the final thing is that social norms change within countries. I mean, look at nuclear and fossil fuels. So, in Japan, people were very comfortable with nuclear energy until Fukushima, and then suddenly not. And now a little bit more comfortable with nuclear again. Germany, not comfortable with nuclear, but France, right next door, yes. At a societal level, Austria, absolutely not. So I think this can change, and we're seeing that the reaction to coal is changing the relationship to nuclear in different parts of the world.
And from what I hear, civil society is now much more prepared to call out and challenge where things go off track. So it's far more difficult to go too far down the wrong path. Particularly in places where we have learnt our lessons, such as large infrastructure energy projects.
Yeah, I think in countries which are democracies, civil society plays a very important role. I think that the space for civil society can get closed down very quickly. Look at Brazil over the last few years. I think that's a problem. And then I think if you're an environmental activist in a country where the space for civil society is not protected and where democracy is not there, it's a very dangerous thing to be. And there are a number of countries around the world where to be an environmental activist is one of the most dangerous things that you can do. And that would go for environmental journalists as well. So at a moment in a transition where we've got a few decades to decarbonize and make our societies more resilient, that's a weakness. That's a strategic weakness for countries. You need civil society.
And you often need them in places where they are most threatened.
Yeah. I mean, so look at Central America, look at parts of Southeast Asia. It's not easy.
I would like to talk to you about something that impinges on the future, that can only be evaluated in the future: net zero. This is something that has caught our imagination in the last few years. Until recently, it was governments that were looked upon to make climate pledges and then meet climate targets and be held accountable for not meeting them, and it sort of became old. But recently, in sort of since Paris certainly, corporations have been stepping up and making pledges and commitments about, first it started with carbon disclosure, then it started with 100% renewable energy by 2030 or some date in the, I would say, distant future. But the most recent, what I call fad, if you will forgive me, is net zero. And large corporations, well-known, recognized large corporations, have made pledges that they will be net zero by 2040, 2043, and so on. I feel that this allows corporations and countries, of course, but countries have been getting off the hook for a long time and we need to do something about it anyway. But it allows large corporations to get off the hook by kicking the can down the road when we know, and I mean the latest assessment from the IPCC makes it even clearer if there was any doubt, that we need to do something in the next 8 years or next 5 years and not wait until 2040. And net zero sounds so good. I mean, who can say no to that? But it hides all the positive emissions that will be made. It will be net zero in 2040. It will be positive until 2040, and all of those emissions are going against our remaining carbon budget. I feel the celebration of net zero pledges is letting countries and corporations off the hook when action is needed here and now rather than 20 years later. But I would like to see it as a positive step forward that allows us to hold these large actors accountable. But I would like to hear your opinion on where we are going on this.
Well, there was a very robust discussion, right, in Paris, around Paris, after Paris, immediately after Paris, about long-term targets versus short-term targets. And the reality is that you need both. And I think that Net Zero 2050 again became a galvanizing framework, which has been useful, excuse me, because it allowed all the big countries to figure out something about what it would mean to do that. And then, of course, you've got the furious discussion about the midterm targets, right? So and in Glasgow at the climate talks last year, I was kind of relieved and pleased to see so many people coming in with 2030 targets, corporations, but also governments. So yes, there were the net zero pledges, but within that there was a 2030 target. Because you're right, 43% of emissions we have to reduce, remove by 2030. Two other things have happened, which is that the net zero pledges by companies are coming, because they understand that this is a journey that we have to go on. Secondly, they can see that that's where governments are. So in 2020, and then into 2021, to have China, the EU, the US, everybody, Japan, South Korea, and then it just flowed. And then, of course, Prime Minister Modi's speech, where all the political journalists got hung up on 2070 as the number, whereas in fact the really big news was the 50% of energy by 2030 to be renewable, which is the most extraordinarily ambitious 2030 goal of any country, I think, right? But the other thing that was happening is that investors are starting to ask questions of companies. So then the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the Transition Pathway Initiative, how do you get from here to net zero, and how do you get to a legitimate 2030 target when we know so much of the emission burden has to be reduced now? These are becoming the questions that investors are asking and consumers will ask. So it's not whether or not you've got a 2050 target that depends entirely on offsets and da-da-da-da. It's like, how are you going to reduce your emissions starting now? How are you going to report out on that? Is it science-based? If it's not science-based, how do you legitimize, how do you justify it? And then, if there are residual emissions that you can't remove as a result of processes, then what are you going to do about that? So we're now into the nitty-gritty. That said, many of the private sector pledges are a little aspirational. So if 2021 was the year of ambition, 2022 is the year of confidence building and implementation. And so there's a lot of going back to the promises that have been made and a sort of validation and verification of that inside companies, by investors with companies, and you're going to see lots of strategic litigation. So the NGOs, the civil society we just talked about, they are going to come after companies if they think that there's anything unreliable about the pledge. And they're going to come after it in terms of consumer protection. They're going to come out in advertising standards. It isn't just going to be on the environment side. So all of this is very much in flux. But it will be important this year to see whether all of the banks and the financial institutions that made a net zero pledge under the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero can actually come a year later and say, yes, and this is how, or whether in fact GFANZ throws some of them out. Same with the Asset Owners Network for Net Zero, which is probably the most robust, the asset managers. And of course you saw the Secretary General of the United Nations 2 weeks ago announce a working group chaired by the former Environment Minister of Canada, Catherine McKenna, and where India's own Arnab Ghosh from CEEW is sitting on the panel. And that panel is going to advise the UN system on what to do and what to understand and the guardrails around pledges that are made by non-state actors. So cities, regions, asset owners, asset managers, banks, insurers, reinsurers, everybody. And so I think that net zero is the right target. I mean, that's the point on the horizon to which we're all headed. But now we've got to sort of funnel ourselves into a legitimate net zero pledge and activity. And then how that gets regulated and held to account over time is a big question. And finally, we're starting to see private industry and private finance telling government, you have to regulate this. Why? Because everybody in business loves a predictable pathway forward, right? So a lot of this is voluntary, a lot of this is very sort of in flux, because the regulators are behind everywhere in the world.
And the investors are bringing the pressure to bear upon regulators to
Yeah, I mean, they are and they aren't, right? So, I mean, there's this famous sort of back and forth by BlackRock and Larry Fink. So it was a big, first of all, his annual letter, gets more and more strident about sustainability. And then we have a bit of a hiccup with a Russian war on Ukraine, and it's like, no, we're back in. And so I think, they're trying to figure out. But it's true that BlackRock is having very meaningful conversations and voting its shares in a way that it never was 2 years ago. And, we would want to see more of that from Fidelity, more from State Street. So the three big passive owners of listed firms. And, but this is a question for RBI, it's a question for Bank of England, it's a question for all of the regulators. I mean, I think the other club that exists now that did not in Paris is the NGFS, the Network of Green Financial System. So this is a group of 85, I think it's 85 central bank governors now. It started with one just after Paris. I was at one of the very first meetings, I think there were 3 central banks. And this is very important because the central banks, regulators and supervisors have to turn the financial system around so that it is enabling net zero rather than getting in the way. And if, as has been clear now from the work of the IMF, the work of the European Central Bank and others, that overexposure to carbon assets is a macroprudential risk, then as regulators, they need to act.
And they are.
And they're beginning
slower.
to, yeah.
They're beginning to act.
Yeah, it needs to go a bit faster. The SEC in the US just released for the first time its consultation on transparency and disclosure for firms in the US. It went further than I think most activists thought it would. It will now go through a 60-day period of, and the Republicans have been very clear they won't support it. But if it survives, it will have a profound effect. ECB in Europe's doing the same thing, Bank of England's doing the same thing, and you start to see other countries as well moving in the right direction, China, Japan, etc. So this is in motion now. But we need to go from voluntary disclosure to mandatory disclosure. We need to go from voluntary stress testing to mandatory stress testing of carbon. So yeah, we're underway, but we're not where we need to be. We need to go faster.
The regulators are always the last to wake up, but as long as they are waking up, I think we can look forward to progress. I have one last item on my agenda to talk to you about, and based on your work and my own interests in food systems. There are 2 aspects of the food system that I find most challenging. One is, of course, from the climate and broader sustainability point of view. I mean, now we know that close to a third of all emissions come from the food system, one way or the other, all the way from production through distribution and consumption to even post-consumption waste. So there is a lot of room there for improvement. But the second aspect is even more important, is that a lot of the first mile and the last mile of the food system around the world and food systems around the world are in the informal economy.
Yeah.
And there are literally billions of people who are on both of these chains, sometimes the same people who are also producing and consuming separate parts of the food system. These two together is that interventions in the food system that contribute a third of the emissions and reach billions of people, everyone eats one way or the other several times a day, makes me believe that interventions in the food system are more likely to help us achieve our targets on many other goals and not just the food system itself. That the food system interventions are actually solutions, and we should stop thinking of the food system as a problem. You have worked on food systems, and even as part of your work on energy, food has been an important part of your work. How do you see the role of the food system in the sustainability debates?
Well, I think it's very wise. I think your own research and your work here at ISB it's a wise strategy around sustainability to work on food systems. Obviously, it's a critically important part of India's future. I think where we come at it at Fletcher, and sort of my own experience is that there's nothing more intimate than your relationship to food, and there's nothing more fundamental to being able to put a plate of food in front of your children. And so we can engage people in the transitions we have to go through food, perhaps more easily than many other things. And you talked about the informal economy around food. There's a female face on that informal economy as well. And if we're going to empower women to be actors for positive change, then this becomes ground zero, really. Food is medicine. For many people in the world, their current diet, food is poison. I work with Dari Masafarian, the Dean of the Friedman School of Nutrition at Fletcher, and he, as a cardiologist, he is very focused on the food that we eat is our medicine. If we put the wrong diet in our mouths, then we are killing ourselves. And of course, if that diet is produced unsustainably, we're also killing the planet. And so you're absolutely right that this is intrinsically the way that we can both take care of ourselves, our own health and well-being, and it's the way that we take care of the planet, which means that you're right, we can see it as a solution. So, for example, in a developed economy like the United States, where people on low income are forced really to eat very unhealthy diets in many cases because it's highly processed food that is available to them at an affordable price, then using health insurers to pay you to eat healthily rather than seeing you arrive in the emergency room of the hospital or in the doctor's surgery. So this is becoming a thing, right? So now we can have another discussion about the healthcare system in the United States. We won't do that. But, for example, my parents are elderly, and they are basically supported and paid to take exercise lessons, right? So that they are not going to be arriving as a healthcare cost to the. So I think that we can see food as a solution. We can see food as a way to engage more closely to nature. Obviously, here in India, you're closer to nature than perhaps many people in Western societies. And that's going to be fundamental to success for climate, for biodiversity, for the war we have with nature at the moment. It will also be important for the battle against waste and pollution. And so I think that the food system, I think we only recently realised how profound the food system is as a problem, and so seeing it as fixing it as a solution, I think, is one of the way to, and it's certainly the way to get young people interested. So it's not only what we eat, it's how we eat it. I think this is an under-focused part of the climate struggle, but also the struggle against waste, pollution, and the need to preserve biodiversity.
Health.
And health. Yeah. I mean, if we can see ourselves in rhythm with nature, and if we can see that the food system is what links the two, then I think that there is enormous opportunity. And so for business, the opportunity is not only from, the hybridization and the ability to grow crops that can survive this changing climate of ours, through to new forms of protein, through to different distribution systems, through to the packaging and the waste, through to the cold chains that mean that a farmer can preserve their value chain, through to the waste that happens between the supermarket and the refrigerator and your plate. I mean, there is enormous opportunities for digital business solutions, for new technology, for new ways of marketing. I mean, there's every aspect of business, of food, can be reformed and provides an opportunity. So I'm very bullish. I think that most people haven't even realised how much the food system is a part of the problem, and therefore haven't really even begun to understand how much solutions to food will be solutions for everything else.
I'm glad to hear that.
Well, I hope it's an area where we're going to work together more in the future.
We will. We are already working closely with Fletcher faculty, particularly Stephen Block.
Professor Steve Block.
And I look forward to more of these conversations. I'm afraid we are out of time on this one, and I would like to just thank you for your thoughts. We hope to count on your experience and your wisdom as we move forward in this partnership. And I wish you the best for the rest of your trip to India.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that we can learn so much from ISB as well. And as India is the largest economy that will grow green, the first economy in modern economic history to grow green, then there's much for us to learn from here as well. So I can't wait to see where this partnership takes us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.